Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Darren Marlia. I'm a group policy MVP and started a little company called SDM Software that focuses on group policy stuff. And I'm here to talk about my favorite topic, group policy and PowerShell. Ever since PowerShell came out, I've sort of been embracing it in the context of group policy. And I'll talk a little bit about what's in the box as well as some of the tools that I've built that you can use for your own environments. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you are also using PowerShell to manage some aspect of group policy today? Okay, a few of you. So what I'm going to focus on is kind of what's available in the box for group policy in Windows 7, Server 2008 R2, what's available from the stuff that I've worked on that I make available for free for managing group policy, troubleshooting group policy, etc., using both of those sets of tools, and then what's coming new in Windows 8 in terms of the PowerShell group policy module. And feel free to ask questions along the way. Probably best to use the mics if you can, but I'll make sure I repeat the question when folks ask it. Oops, wrong one. And don't mind me dancing back and forth. My demo machine's over here, and my PowerPoint's over here, so just got to be a little agile today. So, options for managing group policy with PowerShell. In Server 2008 and Windows 7, Microsoft introduced the group policy PowerShell module. This was kind of the first real presence in the box of group policy enabling, PowerShell enabling of group policy. There's 25 commandlets in that module for doing a bunch of different stuff. Prior to Windows 7 and Server 2008 R2, for those of us that wanted to hack around with this, the GPMC supports a bunch of COM APIs that if you ever used the scripts that came with GPMC, the WSF or script host scripts, those relied on those COM interfaces. You can still get access to those today in group policy, but it's really kind of not for the faint of heart, and that's why the PowerShell module that Microsoft shipped was helpful. And then a bunch of, before the Windows 7 world came on, I had built a set of wrapper commandlets around those COM APIs with coincidentally 25 commandlets that you can still use today in XP and 2003 environments if you want to do group policy related PowerShell stuff and you still have those environments. And then I built a bunch of commandlets since then for helping troubleshoot and report on and do interesting things with group policy. And I'll show you some of those as well. And those are all available for free from my various websites. So the first thing to do to get started with this, if you haven't already, is install GPMC. With GPMC comes the PowerShell module. So if you already have GPMC on your machine, you probably have PowerShell on your machine, then the module's there. So then it's a simple matter of loading the module, open up PowerShell, import module group policy, and you're done. You have access to those 25 commandlets. If you want to get a list of the commandlets that are in that module, just use the get commandlet to tell it you want the commandlets in the group policy module, and it'll spit out the list. So what does it cover? It's pretty extensive. Creating, deleting, renaming, getting GPOs. So getting information on group policy objects. Backing up, restoring, copying, importing, creating, and getting starter GPOs. Just out of curiosity, how many of you use starter GPOs? That's what I thought. One! Winner! I wish I had something to give you. Yeah, I'm still not sure what they're for, but there they are. So the commandlets support creating and getting information on those. Getting and setting GP inheritance. So things like block inheritance on an OU. Getting and setting GPO permissions. So being able to set delegation on a GPO. Creating, deleting, modifying GPO links. There's a missing piece here, and I'll talk about it in a second. But if you want to link a GPO through a script, you can do it. If you want to delete that link, you can do it. If you want to set the link to enforced, you can do it. Getting GPO settings. So if you go into GPMC, you click on a GPO, you click the settings tab, you get that nice HTML settings report. You can do that through PowerShell as well. And then getting an RSOP report. So go out, touch a machine, get result and set a policy on that machine. Getting, setting, deleting administrative template settings. I'll talk a little bit more about this one when I show you a demo of this. This was Microsoft's first foray into giving you the ability to read and write settings within the GPO. Today it's restricted to administrative template settings, i.e. registry policy, and GP preferences registry policy, which is that section in GP preferences that lets you write registry values. So just really registry policy is what's supported. So some of the things that are missing, ironically, you can't get links, information about links by SOM or by GPO. You can't get or set WMI filters. Actually, that's not completely true. You can get information about what WMI filters are linked to a GPO. But you can't manage WMI filters themselves. You can't write deny ACEs onto GPO permissions. And this all pertains to the built-in module in the box. There are ways around this if you're interested in scripting and getting into the COM APIs. But from what's in the box with the module is what I'm talking about. You can't write SOM delegation. So you know when you click on an OU in GPMC, there's a little drop-down box under the delegation tab that lets you set things like who can link GPOs to this, who can do RSOP planning or logging against that OU. So that's not exposed. You cannot read the list of existing GPO backups. You can create a backup, but you can't say, tell me all the backups that are in this directory. And you can't read and write GPO settings outside of administrative templates or GP preferences. I mentioned that. But still, there's a lot that you can do. And the ones that have little asterisks around them are also ones that, when I built my GPMC commandlets for XP in 2003, those functionality were exposed in those commandlets, and I'll show you a little bit of that. And you can use the commandlets on Win 7 and Server 2008 environment. So between the combination of the two, you can get all of this stuff, except for the writing of settings outside of those two areas. So what's there is a lot of power. This is my favorite group policy PowerShell one-liner. Basically what this is doing, and I'll dig into this in a little bit, is creating a new GPO, modifying it, adding a new setting to it, using the registry, the capability of the registry commandlet, permissioning it so that a particular security group processes this, and then linking it to an OU. So this kind of, not that you're going to do this every day, but I wrote this to sort of illustrate the power of what you can do using the built-in commandlets. And I'll dig into this in a second, so if you're kind of glazing over as you look at this, I'll kind of tear it apart and show you what it's all about. In addition, there's a lot of information you can get from this simple get GPO commandlet. So it's designed to get you information about the group policy object quickly and easily. You can even point it at all GPO objects. There's an all parameter that comes with this commandlet. So you can say, go grab a bunch of information about all commandlets and shove it into the pipeline so I can do things with it in PowerShell. This is a barely legible screenshot that kind of gives you the idea. Up in the top, I talk about, or this is basically returning information about the default domain policy, and then I'm using the getMember alias to grab all of the methods and properties on this, so you get a chance to see a little bit about what information is available on this powerful commandlet. So let's switch gears, and I will do a little demo on the group policy module. Let me try doing this, and I'll ask afterwards if you can all see it. So this is my one-liner. Can you guys see it in the back? Or is it kind of barely legible? You're good? Okay. So this is going out and doing my one-line operation to create, modify, link, and permission this GPO. So the first thing I'm doing while it's running is I'm calling new GPO, which is one of the 25 commandlets, giving it a new policy name. I'm piping the output of that to set GP registry value, which is passing in a registry key that I want to set, a value name, no help menu, the type of registry value it is, dword, and the value that I'm setting it to is 1. Now, you're probably asking, where the hell did I get this from? Where the heck did I get this from? Sorry about that. And it's not necessarily intuitive, but essentially what I did is I found the policy item that I wanted to set, looked at the underlying admin template file to find out what registry value it was writing when you enabled it, and used that to drive that commandlet. So the thing to know about these commandlets is they are expecting raw registry information. In other words, key name, value type, and value. So what you see in GP Editor, and let me go ahead and show you what this created. I'll go ahead and refresh my list. Make this guy bigger when it comes back. When it comes back. All right. So I'm going to go down to my IE no help policy. And what you see is it linked it to the marketing OU. It permissioned it so that only marketing users read it. And if I go in and look at the settings, you should see an administrative template setting using the friendly admin template path that shows you the policy that I set. Turn off displaying the Internet Explorer help menu. Now, again, this path that you see in GP Editor is not what you're using in that commandlet, but by going into the ADM or ADMX file and grabbing that information out, you can essentially set any admin template setting. And when you set it, it shows it in the friendly name that GPMC normally provides. So that's kind of the quick and dirty on using that set GP registry value to modify admin template settings. Now let's look further at what this is doing. Now what I'm doing here is I'm setting GP permissions, and I'm saying replace. Let me just scroll over here because I lost the. Setting the option to replace the permission on the GPO. Permission level is set to none, meaning I want to remove the permission for authenticated users. So as you know, by default, when a GPO gets created, authenticated users is granted rights to process the policy. Well, that means that everyone, computers and users in the domain, will process this policy underneath where it's linked. In my case, I just wanted the marketing users group to be able to process this. So I remove authenticated users from the permission set. And the target type parameter just tells it that it's a group rather than a user. Then what I do is I pipe that to another call to set GP permissions, to set the permission level to GPO apply. This is the permission that grants read and applied group policy on the GPO. If I was delegating the ability to edit the GPO, there's a different permission. I think it's like GP edit or something like that, GPO edit, that I could apply to this. Then I'm doing the target as marketing users group. The target type is group. And that adds the marketing users to delegation to that GPO. And then finally, I call new GP link to target the marketing OU. And I tell it what order I want this to be in. The order is important if you have multiple GPOs linked to a container like an OU because there is an order of processing on that container. So this is telling it, put it at the top of the list in terms of processing priority. Any questions on that? The question is, does it default to the last one if I don't put an order? That's a good question, and I can't remember. I know I tested that. I think it does. I think it just puts it at the bottom of the list. Okay, great. So let's spend a little bit more time looking at some other things that you can do with the built-in commandlets. So let's play around with getGPO. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a variable to getGPO, default domain policy, and it's as simple as giving it the policy name, like that. The other parameter that I mentioned was the all parameter. You can use the all parameter to literally get a output of all GPOs in the domain. Because I'm on a VPN connection and I have over 200 GPOs, I won't try that here. But let's go ahead and get some information on the default domain policy. So what this is doing is going out, grabbing properties, information on this default domain policy. When it comes back, what I'll do is show you the properties on the GPO by just echoing out the variable $GPO. You can see display name, domain name, owner, GUID, whether the GPO status is that little drop-down box that you can do in a group policy that says user settings disabled, computer settings disabled, or both sides if you want. Any description, which is the comment that you can put on a GPO. And then when it was created, when it was last modified, the user version. So as you know, or probably know, when group policy stores itself, it stores half of itself in AD and half in sysvol. It's not exactly half, but it stores some pieces in AD and some in sysvol. It keeps version information on that so that the client, be it server or workstation, knows whether something has changed on that GPO. So the version is important in terms of determining whether the client has to do work to refresh settings. So that version information is returned. It tells me two things. It tells me the version of the GPO for both the computer and the user side. It also tells me if they're in sync. If they were, like for example, if the AD version on this computer's version side was 60 and the sysvol version was 59, that would tell me that there was a replication problem in sysvol for the DC that I'm hitting. And it would be essentially missing a piece of that GPO. Question? The question is where do you get the username that has created the GPO? The owner is the user or group that initially created the GPO, and it's usually the group. Yeah. So the other thing you can do with this commandlet is, let's go ahead and say get member. There's a bunch of methods and properties on this, and you'll notice a bunch of interesting methods called backup, copy to, delete, etc., generate report. These are actually native methods on the group policy object that gets returned from PowerShell. These functions are actually wrapped into other commandlets in that list of 25. Like backup has a separate commandlet, backup GPO. So you don't need to use these native methods to get at that functionality. They're there if you wanted to, but you don't need to use them. There's a couple things that are kind of added little gifts in here that you can call that, that you don't get from the commandlets. One of them is, if I wanted to call $GPO is ACL consistent, it will actually go out and check the access control entries on all the replicas of this GPO and return a true or false. You can also make ACLs consistent if it's not. You probably have gotten this pop-up in the past in GPMC where it says, hey, something's wrong with the access control list on these GPOs. Do you want me to make it consistent? And that's essentially that functionality exposed through PowerShell. Another thing you can do is get WMI filter information about a GPO. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and, let me clear the screen. I'm going to get a reference to a different GPO called WMI filter test. Aptly named because that's what I'm going to do. Waiting. Okay. WMI. So I'm going to go ahead and get information on the group policy object here. And you just notice that there's now a reference to a WMI filter on this guy. If I go ahead and type $GPO, WMI filter, you get some properties on this that returns interesting information about this filter. The name, the description. If I do a format list on it, let me just do that. You can see it in a little better format. This path is kind of not very interesting, but what you can do is do a $GPO WMI filter get members, and you notice a nice little method here called get query list. As you know, a WMI filter can have one or more WQL queries in it. So what I can actually do is go ask it for the actual query on the WMI filter. So in a roundabout way, I can get what filter information or what query this filter is using to do its operation or to do its testing. So there's some cool stuff kind of buried in here that you can like seek out and find. Get member is one of my favorite commandlets because it's kind of like the what's behind the curtain type of commandlet. It tells you a lot of interesting stuff about the thing that that's being output. So the other thing I can do with the 25 built-in commandlets is I can do result and set a policy. Get GP, result and set a policy. And I want to tell it where I want to put the output of that. I'll say data rsop, mytest.html. You have to give it a file that you want to send this to. Report type HTML. The computer I want to run it against, it's called Win7 test. And then, what else am I missing? The user that I want to get, if I want to get user information about not only just the computer RSOP, but also the user RSOP. As you know, if you have multiple users logging into a computer, each one of them is going to process policy, and each one of them can have RSOP information on it. So if there's a particular user logging onto a particular computer you want to get RSOP about, you can optionally specify the user parameter. And if I go ahead and run this, and it does have to go out and touch the remote workstation, so it's going to take a little bit of time. It comes back with some information that basically tells me that it worked. It did user and computer for this user, for this computer. This namespace is only interesting if you're messing around with RSOP directly. And RSOP mode was logging. Now what I can do is, let's go ahead and bring up that folder where I stored that file. And you'll see here that my test is right here, and it looks very familiar. This is the view that you would get in GPMC for doing RSOP on a machine. And you get the settings. In this case, there were no user settings, but you get user configuration information about which GPOs were processed, applied and denied, etc. So you can get at this information from PowerShell. PowerShell also gives you the ability to export this as XML. So if you're familiar with PowerShell's capabilities for manipulating, reading, navigating through XML, you could generate an XML file, load that up using the PowerShell commandlets, and essentially navigate through that data programmatically. Any questions on the RSOP stuff? Yeah, question. Yeah. Right. So the question is, does this just do a GP result on the remote machine? And effectively, that is what it's doing. So it's essentially collecting RSOP data just the way GPMC or GP result would against the remote machine. The only requirements, of course, which are the same requirements if you're doing it for GP result or GPMC, is you can't have a firewall blocking those remote administration ports like 135 and I think 445. So you need to be able to do a remote WMI call against the machine. But that is essentially what this is doing, is it's essentially giving you a programmatic PowerShell way to do gpresult.exe. And why it's useful in PowerShell is when you get the output, you can then manipulate it. You can do, as I mentioned, you can parse the XML if you return XML data. You could even parse the HTML if you wanted to do that. Question in the back? I can barely hear you. It sounds... Okay. Question is, can you only run this against Windows 7 or 2008 R2? And the answer is no. You can run this against XP and 2003 as well. Because it's just using basic RSOP that's been in the box since XP, it works just fine. Question in front. Do you need 2008 R2 DCs for it to work? No, you do not. Once the commandlets are installed on a Win 7 or 2008 R2 box, they'll work against down-level XP 2003, 2008 R2 boxes. Okay. The last commandlet I just want to demo through the module is the backup GPO commandlet. So this one's pretty easy to use. I have a couple different options. I can back up all GPOs, which I won't do here for the same reason I mentioned earlier. Or I can back up just one GPO. So I can say, go ahead and back up the default domain policy. And give it a path where you want to store the backups. And give it a comment if you want. So this is back up my DDP. And we're good to go. And this is going to go talk to a domain controller, grab all the backup data, and stuff it into that folder. And why this is kind of useful is, A, it's a lot simpler than the WSF script in terms of using it, calling it. And you can put this into a scheduled task or have it run periodically so that you can always have backups of your GPOs. I like to do this kind of on a periodic basis just because I mess with my GPOs so much that it's nice to be able to go backwards in time. Question? That's a good question. Let me wait till it returns and I'll do the get help on it. I can't remember if you can or not with this one. Yeah, so, Any other questions? What's that? Can you do a restore? Well, you can definitely do a restore. I think it's actually restore-GPO. And you point it at the backup path and you give it the ID. I think the ID, we'll do that next. You give it the ID of the GPO backup that you want to get, and it will go grab it and restore it, just like you could do in the GUI. You can also do copy and import. There we go, it's back. So let's do a get help on backup GPO. There it is. And let's see, path, domain, server. So you can provide through the server parameter a DC that you want to hit. I think most of the commandlets support that. And then restore, let's do a get help on restore GPO. So you can just see what that looks like. So with restore, you've got lots of options. You can restore all. That would be dangerous. Backup ID. So this is not the GUID of the GPO. This is the GUID that gets assigned to the backup. If I go into let me go into my folder where I have my GP backups. You'll see these GUIDs. This represents the two. I backed up one earlier. These are two distinct backups. It's that GUID that you feed into the commandlet to tell it which backup you want to restore. So you give it the backup ID, the path where the folder where you have the backup stored, and optionally you can restore it into a different domain, use a different server, etc. Question? Yes, so the question is, if I have a test and a production domain, can I use this to help keep GPOs in sync between them? And the answer is absolutely. So just like you can back up a GPO from GPMC in a test forest, and as long as the files, the backup files that I just showed you, are accessible to the new forest, you can import those in. You're going to get some messages about, if there are SIDs associated with those, do you want to transfer those, or how do you want to deal with those SIDs? There's actually support in the import GPO. Let me get that up. The import GPO commandlet, which is different than restore. Import says, I want to create a new GPO, take a backup, and dump all of the settings into it. Restore is designed to, if you've got the GPO that you've backed up and you messed it up somehow, I want to restore on top of that existing GPO. So with with import, just as in the GUI, you have the ability to do what are called migration tables. And they are mapping files that let you map things like security principles. Maybe you have restricted groups policy that's got specific groups in it that are domain specific, and you want to map it to the other domains, different groups. You create a mapping file and pass it into the commandlet to do that mapping as it's importing it. So you can absolutely do that scenario of test to production with this. And just the thing to keep in mind is you're overwriting settings every time. You're not merging, you're overwriting. There's no ability to say, only bring over what's different between test and production. All right. Let's switch back to the slides. Any other questions on any of that I showed in the module? Great. So, other ways to manage group policy with PowerShell. So, again, I've been busy over the last few years building a bunch of little tools and utilities that I make available for free on my various websites. If you've ever been to gpoguy.com, that's me. There's a free tools library section. There's a few different, well, actually, I think right now there's just this one snap-in or module that we provide. It's called Get SDM GPO Version, and it does two things. It acts like GPO tool in terms of checking version consistency of GPOs across your environment. So if you go in and use GPO tool, if you're familiar with that, it's not a PowerShell utility, but it goes and checks GPO versions across all GPOs, so you can find version inconsistency. That commandlet does that, kind of PowerShellizes GPO tool. It doesn't do any more than just version checking. GPO tool also does some ACL checking, so it's not a complete duplicate of functionality, but for version types of things, getting it into PowerShell, using it in a script to sort of automatically check versions and do something like send you an email if it detects a version inconsistency, it can do that. There's another one that's in there called Invoke SDM Touch GPO. That's kind of a nifty little thing that I came up with. So I talked about versions earlier and how they affect client processing. And I had a scenario once where I wanted to be able to not have to go out and touch all of my clients, but I wanted them to think that there was a change in the GPO. So what this commandlet does is it touches the version number. If you're familiar with the touch command in Linux or Unix, it essentially updates the version number on the GPO. And what that does is sort of fake the clients into thinking that something's changed. So the next time they process policy, they're going to go out and grab the settings again. So this is kind of a fringy use case, but it comes in handy every once in a while, and I stuffed it in with that snap-in for Get GPO Version. So that's out there. And then on SDM Software, I have a freeware page that has a bunch of policy-related PowerShell stuff. Again, all free. The GPMC commandlets that I mentioned earlier that have been around for a while, those are out there. 1.4 added module support, so in PowerShell 2, there's now a module that you can use. The GP refresh commandlet lets you perform remote GP refreshes from PowerShell. I'll talk about how this is being added in Windows 8. Finally, they'll have a commandlet in Windows 8 to do this. But for down-level stuff, that commandlet is there. And then my personal favorite, the GP health commandlet. I'll show you how this works, but essentially this thing is designed to go out and grab health information about GP processing on target systems. It's a little like a RSOP Lite. So this is the output from the version testing commandlet. And what you see is, for a particular DC, it'll tell me all the version information for every GPO. It's also got a nifty little parameter that I'll show you in a little bit that lets you just see differences. The other option you have is the GP refresh commandlet lets you do remote GP refreshes. So you can do things like target a particular system. And of course, if you had some AD commandlets that went and got all computers on a particular OU, you could pipe that to this commandlet and essentially refresh all computers on that OU. You can, if you need to send different credentials to that machine to connect to it, let's say it's, I don't know, you don't have the ability to remotely administer it with your default account you want to run as, so to speak, you can pass those in. You can tell it that you only want to update the computer side of policy. In other words, if you're familiar with GP Update, it lets you choose whether you want to only refresh computer policy or also user policy. If you don't specify computer or user, it does both. And then it also has the various parameters that GP Update has for force, log off, boot, synchronous, etc. So you can do most of what you can do in GP Update with this commandlet. I'm sorry? Oh, ignore. When there are prompts that get thrown by PowerShell, it ignores them. And so it supports the, like, what if is, tell me what it would do. To be honest with you, I can't remember if I implemented what if, but you have to do it when you build the commandlet. But those are default parameters within PowerShell. What does the GP Health commandlet do? It's kind of a little quick and dirty troubleshooting tool. So you can return a bunch of information about a single machine, an OU of machines, or even a domain of machines, which is not necessarily recommended, but there you go. It's got that capability. It returns an overall red or green status. Well, how do you derive that? What I do is I say, so there's two phases to group policy processing. There is the core phase. The core phase says, go get the list of GPOs that apply to the current user or computer based on security filtering and linking and all that stuff. Give me that list. And then from that list, the client-side extension phase goes and does the actual work of processing policy. So the CSE, client-side extension, let's say it's admin templates, fires up, gets its list of GPOs that implement admin templates, and runs through and processes them all. So if either of those two phases, the core phase or the client-side extension phase, fails for whatever reason, I return a red. If they succeed, it's green. Does that mean that every setting that you need to got to the machine? Not necessarily, because it could fail in unexpected ways and still return success. But what it does do is kind of help you get to problematic machines. So that red or green status returns. It returns a bunch of information about the machine, like the OS version it's running, the DC that it used for the last time it processed policy, whether a slow link was detected, whether loopback is enabled, whether fast logon is enabled. This is that flag you can set to make it all synchronous. It gives you all the GPs processed by user and computer, how long the policy processing cycle took overall, and then the CSEs that were processed and whether they ran successfully or not. So kind of a bunch of information about GP processing. Some of this information you get from an RSOP run. Some of it you don't. Like loopback, it doesn't tell you that. Slow link, I don't know if I can't. Yeah, it does tell you that. A few other things like the DC that was used. So it's kind of a superset of the summary information in RSOP, but also lighter weight because it's not going and grabbing settings information. Question? Does it grab sysvol information? It actually does. So what this is doing is it's going out and touching the client and grabbing the data stored on the client related to the last time it processed policy. So what we'll do is actually tell you the version number of the GPO that it last processed. So it's not touching the GPOs themselves, it's touching the client and finding out the client's view of the world from a group policy processing perspective. So if you, for example, know that a GPO is at version 10, and this thing comes back and tells you that GPO that was processed by this machine was version 9, you know that the client hasn't gotten the most recent version of the policy. Does it say where the sysvol came from? You get that from the DC that was last used for processing. By definition, it's going to get that information from the DC, that field, DC last used for processing, will be the DC that it got AD and sysvol content from. And this is just an example of the output. I'll get into this in a demo in a bit. So let's go ahead and switch gears and kind of run through some of these commandlets. All right. Let me just see my little cheat sheet here. So let's go ahead and do the update SDMGP. I'm going to target it at my Win7 test machine. I'm going to tell it, actually that's all I'm going to tell it. And what this is doing is going out and doing a GP refresh against that machine. It tells me that it refreshed successfully. I didn't specify force or boot or sync or any of those options. If I specified force or boot or log off, all of those will trigger some kind of impact on that machine, whether it's a log off or a restart, unless you tell it not to. Let me see if I have I might have to switch directories to get the help for this. Nope, there it is. So what I can do here is pass off, let me just, if I use the force parameter, I'm trying to remember now actually. Yeah, I think if I use force, let me try that. I don't want to reboot my system, but let me. If the machine needs to reboot as a result of the force, like it would with GP update, it'll actually go and reboot that machine. So you just have to be careful, just like you do with GP update, of which flag you pass to it. Okay, any questions on the update commandlet? Again, you can run that against a single machine, or you could pipe a list of machines to it and have it run through and do that. There's some nice features that they added in the Windows 8 version of this that I'll show you in a second that make it a little bit more friendly if you're doing this against hundreds of machines at once. You're going to get hundreds of machines contacting their DC and doing a GP refresh, so you have to be sort of careful about how you do this. Okay. Get SDM GPO version. This is the GPO tool knockoff that I talked about. So what it does is it goes out and grabs version information from the particular DC that I pick, or in this case, I didn't pass it a DC, so it's going to go ahead and grab it from the PDC emulator by default. And it literally is returning for this focused DC all of the GPOs on that DC with their version numbers. There's a commandlet or a parameter that I support on this commandlet called diffs only that will actually return only differences. If you only want to see if there is something inconsistent, it'll actually go ahead and return just the GPOs that are inconsistent. And these are all PowerShell objects that you could pipe to a file. You could pipe to another operation that might go and manipulate them. Each of these columns that you see are properties on the object. So the AD version, the sysvol version, the GPO name, all essentially grab, basically are PowerShell objects. Okay, let's do a get help on that. Let's see, what was I? Yep, GPO version. So we can pass in domain name, the DC name to use, and there's that diffs only parameter. Questions on that one? Okay, great. All right, finally, let me do the get SDM GP health commandlet. So let's do get SDM, let's do get help on it first, get SDM GP health. And again, you can pass it a computer name, you can pass it an OU distinguished name, and it'll actually go through and query AD, find all the computers in that OU, and run health against it. You can pass credentials in the form of a PS credential object, PowerShell credential object. If you need to connect to the machine in a particular OU or somewhere using different credentials than what you're running in PowerShell, you can do that sort of run as operation. You can output the data as XML. You can tell it, I only want computer data or user data. And that's about it. So let's go ahead and just run get SDM GP health. Go up to the top of the screen. Computer name, Win7 test. And what it's going to do is go out and collect a bunch of information about that machine. As I mentioned, the overall status, the time that this was logged, the name of the computer, the domain, the operating system version, whether those core status and client-side extension status or actually, I'm sorry, this is just core status for the computer and user, whether those succeeded or failed, whether fast logon was enabled, computer slow link detected, loopback detected, DC that was used, how long the computer processing took. In this case, it took about 4 seconds. This was the last processing cycle is what this is showing you. And then it shows you, like, if there was a currently logged on user on the machine, it would return that username, whether the user slow link was detected, and then user elapsed time. Since there weren't any GPOs, there was no elapsed time for the user processing. Then it proceeds to tell me the computers that were processed, the computer GPOs that were processed, the user GPOs that were processed, and then the computer CSEs that were processed. So what I can do is manipulate this a little bit like I manipulated the get GPO commandlet. So let's just go ahead and do this again, but this time I'm going to assign it to a variable called health. A CSE is a client-side extension. So that's essentially what that is a fancy name for the policy areas in group policy. So admin templates, folder redirection, software installation, each runs independently and processes policy settings. They are implemented as client-side extensions. That's the Microsoft technical term for them. There are a bunch of DLLs that run in the system that do their operation to actually process the settings. So now I have this health variable. And I can go ahead and grab that same information, but what I can also do now is dig in a little bit. So I can go to the computer GPOs processed, and I can get a list of the GPOs that were processed by the client, put it in a nice friendly version. And again, this is telling me the client's view of the world from a policy perspective. This is not talking to the GPOs or the domain controllers themselves. This is talking to the client and saying, what did you do during the last processing cycle? What version of default domain policy, GPC is the sysvol part, and GPT is the sysvol part, and GPC is the AD part. It's telling me that those two, as I read them from my DC, SDM2, those two pieces of this default domain policy were in sync. If they weren't in sync, it would show me that. The date and time that the policy was processed. You can, not from the list of the GPOs that were processed, but if I dig in a little further on the client-side extensions that were processed, what you see here is that the client-side extension, the only one that was called on computer was security. If I go ahead and, this is a collection of objects, so if I go ahead and say, tell me what GPOs were processed by CSE, what you then see is details around when this client-side extension last read settings for security policy, and that operation completed successfully. It also tells me where the GPO was linked right here. So I know which policy, which link it was actually looking at. So all this information, if this were a machine with user policy and computer policy, you could essentially loop through all the extensions to look at things like the last time of processing, whether it succeeded, et cetera. So there's a lot of rich information you can get out of this to help with troubleshooting in scripts. Question?
Yeah, if the client processed the GPO that had a mismatched version, that is completely eventually?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, if there's a mismatched version, like AD and sysvol are out of sync, would status still show as green? And currently it does. And here's why. From a group policy processing perspective, the client doesn't necessarily care that there's a version mismatch. It will process what's in the AD and sysvol as they are. One of the things that I've been thinking about doing is adding different criteria for what is considered to be green versus red, and that's one of them, because it is a flag of, hey, this machine isn't going to have necessarily all the stuff that it should have because it's missing some pieces in sysvol, for example. Usually it's sysvol that fails. So today you would have to test for that version inconsistency through that calling the properties on the client-side extension to see that, to know that there's a mismatch. But that's a good question. Anything else on the health commandlet? Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and shift back for kind of the final section of this, which is what's new in Windows 8. And unfortunately, in terms of the group policy module, the answer is not much. There's one new commandlet for doing the remote GP refresh that I talked about. One of the nice things that it does do is it supports a random delay. So you can say, if I'm pushing this out to 100 machines by piping it from a list of machine names, don't do them all as the command is delivered. Put a random delay of up to a minute on them. So you can give it a random delay factor, and as it goes out, that random delay will delay when the GP refresh hits for up to whatever it is, however many minutes it is. So you get a staggered update of your clients. I should also mention that this functionality is now also exposed in GPMC. So you can right-click on an OU in GPMC, and you get a GUI experience. If you've played around with the Windows 8 beta, you'll see this. You get a GUI experience that shows you as each machine is being updated. So it's kind of cool. Great functionality that, it'd been nice to have a long time ago, but hey, I'll take it now. You can use force boot, log off, sync, just like you can with GP Update. You can target user or computer only, just like you can with GP Update. And let me just quickly, not much to show here, but I'll show it to you nonetheless, because it's Windows 8, so it's kind of new and cool. Let's do a get help on invoke GP Update. Oh, what did it do? Sorry. Get help. I guess I should try actually typing the correct name for the commandlet. There it is. You can pass it a computer name, random delay in minutes. You can do it as a job, so it could essentially run asynchronously. And you can target, here you can target user or computer. And again, you've got all of your boot, log off, sync parameters. So I can go ahead and invoke GP Update, computer, Win7 test. So obviously I can do this against access denied. Apparently I need to, I know why I can't do it, because I'm not in the same domain as Win7 test. Sorry about that. Looks like I can't pass it parameters username, so I would have to run as I'd have to do a PowerShell run this command or this console session as that domain user. But just for the sake of argument, let's just do it against this machine itself. So this guy is called Win8 server. So I'll go and say invoke GP Update, computer, Win8 server, and it basically did it. Doesn't give you any, obviously with PowerShell, giving you feedback means sending it to the pipeline. So you sort of have to be careful with how that works. But essentially, it's going out and doing it. It does have all the same constraints about firewall. You need to be able to do remote WMI against this thing. So same thing that you would have with any of the other tools that do this, like GP Update. Actually, GP Update doesn't work remotely. Question?
Besides this, the other ones you showed, is it PowerShell v2 or v1 would also do it?
PowerShell, the ones that I built can do PowerShell v1 as well. This one is strictly Windows 8. Any other questions about Windows 8 functionality with respect to PowerShell or just in general? Yeah? Is there any way to search the settings inside of a GPO? The only thing you can do in the context of PowerShell is use the let me just switch back to it. Is if I do a get command on the group policy module, you get GPO report. So if I do get help, get GPO report, I can essentially generate XML version of the settings report. Unfortunately, it's a little bit raw. If I do, I'll just show you so you can see what it's all about. Get GPO report, name, let's just pick default domain policy. report type, XML, and path, I'll do cdata ddp.xml. There's actually there's a Scripting Center article about doing this. And I think what it's doing is this. So it's outputting the data to XML, and then it's using PowerShell to manipulate the data to be able to search settings. The thing you have to know about the XML data, and I'll show you that right now, is it's raw. It doesn't necessarily show you the friendly name of all the settings. So if we get down, this is all permission stuff on the GPO. If we get down into the data, these are the raw names of the policies. These are not the friendly names that you see in the GUI. So you have to know that clear text password is, if I go into the GUI, and let's just bring up the default domain policy. Actually, I'll just bring up the settings on it. Slow. If I go in under security settings, account policy, password policy, it's this policy right here. So you sort of have to know that, here it is, XML, that this means that. And that's the closest you can get to searching the settings with, free PowerShell stuff. Question? What version of PowerShell is in Windows 8? It's version 3. Yep. Okay, I think that is what I had. So let me switch back. That's what I had. So I'm happy. We still have time left, so I'm happy to answer a few more questions if anyone has any. Otherwise, thank you very much. Please fill out the evaluation. That's how I get to come back, so appreciate it. Thanks.